All right. Well, we're on part 7. This is part 6 of my page, but I knew that was wrong. We're on part 7 of our study of the book of Ecclesiastes. And our text today begins the preacher's second message. So the first message started in chapter 1, verse 12, and went to chapter 6, verse 9. And he talked about what is the meaning of life. Is there any meaning to be found? And he talked about his discovery process and how in the end of it all he discovered that there is no meaning to this life. There is meaning to be found, but it is not in this life. And this life is just repetition after repetition. It's cyclical. Everything that happens to one person happens to another. It's just the details may be slightly different. And so it's just vanity. It's vain to live it. And so we need to find how we can make our lives meaningful and purposeful in this meaningless life. And so he begins his second message where he is now going to give us a bunch of advice on how then do we live to make our lives meaningful in this meaningless world. So if you have your Bibles, open them to Ecclesiastes chapter 6. We read this in our scripture reading this morning, 6:10. Now we're going to go down to 6:14. I know we read to the end of 18, but we're going to go to 14 in terms of to 7:14 in our text. So the preacher there, he begins now at chapter 6, verse 10, saying this: whatever has come to be has already been named. Now this is actually a familiar lesson. He's talked about this in this first discovery in lesson 1, in his search for to the meaning of life. And his conclusion again was that everything that happens has happened before. There's nothing new under the sun. That's why life really is monotonous. Chapter 6, verse 10 is actually very similar to chapter 3, verse 15, where he says, that which is already has been, and that which is to be already has been. So it's interesting, the present has happened before, but the future, it's going to happen, it's already happened before as well. There's no real purpose or meaning to life. It's just all repetition. He focuses in on the cyclical nature of life, so that we look at any person. A person is born, they're educated, they get married, they get a job, they buy a house, they have children, he sells the house, he retires, moves to the nursing home, and then he dies. And that's really what it is for everyone. Slightly different for some women than men, but essentially they are all the same. In fact, ever since the day of Cain's birth, it has been the same for every person. There is a time to be born and a time to die, and a time for everything in between. The only difference really between one person and another is the technology and the wealth that is available to them. Now the moderator said something very similar to this also in chapter 1, verse 9, when he's introducing the topic of meaning. And he says, what has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. In our text today, the preacher presents a new twist to this, in that he's talking about the cyclical and repetitive nature of life, but he adds something new. If you look at it in verse 10, he says it has already been, what? What does it say there? It has already been named. So what does he mean when he adds this to the phrase? What he's meaning by this is not only is there nothing new under the sun, but everything has been planned under the sun. Scholars tell us that to name something means to make it exist or to bring it into being. So So he's thinking here of creation again. And he's thinking of God's role, that God is outside of creation, outside of time. And he tells us that, he reminds us that God spoke, and God brought creation into being. And he brought it into being by the power of his word. So in Genesis 1:5, we read that God created the light and created the darkness. And then it tells us he called the light day, or he named it day, and the darkness he called night. So he's named every aspect of creation because he brought it into being. And it was planned. That's the idea behind this. So everything that has come into existence in the past, everything that has happened, that is happening in the present, everything that will happen in the future, was previously known by God and brought into being by God at the right time. Okay? Because it was planned by God. And everything is planned out from beginning to end. And so the preacher continues in verse 10 and he says, and it is known what man is. Now the Hebrew word here is actually the word Adam. And which we know that when God named the first man, he named him Adam, after the fact that he came from Adama, which means that he came from the ground. So Adam means is reference to mankind, and refers to the fact that he came from the dust of the earth. So in Psalm 103, verse 14, it tells us that God knows our frame. In other words, he knows how we are made. And it says he remembers that we are dust. And God even declared in the curse, when he was cursing mankind through Adam in Genesis 3:19, he said, you are dust, and to dust you will return. God knows what man is. We're beginning to know and understand what we are as we live, because we discover that we are not in control, that people are weak, people are unable to create. They are the created and are unable to plan things and to plan the events of life, or even to give purpose to life. We can't do that. It's outside of our realm. Now we can plan some things, or so it would seem. And we can do some meaningful things. We do make real choices that bring about real things. It's not saying that we don't have choices, that we don't have a will, but everything about our life has already been planned by God. And God brings about that plan through our willing choices. It's only God who is able to make a master plan and cause it to happen exactly as he planned it to be. Life is out of our control. So what he has said here in this opening verse is that everything that has happened before, because life is cyclical. But everything that has happened and is going to happen was planned by God. And life is out of our control. God controls everything. Now, of course, once you understand this, that God is the all-powerful creator, it's reasonable to conclude that he also preserves and governs everything in the universe as well. That just makes sense. He's not an absentee God. He didn't create things and then walk away and let nature take its course. Nature cannot run its course if God is not actively involved. Of course, nature is not nature without God. So, life, though, is not determined. It's not determined by chance. It's not determined by fate, but it's determined by who? By God, exactly. Okay, and it's useless for man to try to argue with God or try to manipulate God to make our lives go the way we want them to go. Man is not in control. So again, we're free to make willing choices with real consequences, but we are not free to will what God has not willed. Okay, we are not outside of God's control. So look at verse 10 again. He goes on and says, he is not able to dispute with one stronger than he. Of course, the one that's stronger than man is who? It's God, yeah. It's referring to God there. Job found this out. Job, of course, we know suffered a lot. And he had a lot of losses in his life and some horrible heartache. And as his friends were trying to comfort him, it turned into this arguing match, and he started to dispute with God. And it tells us that in the end, he had to repent in dust and ashes in Job 42:6. In the end of it all, Job knew that God had willed his losses and sufferings to happen. I mean, listen to what God says in Isaiah 45:9. Woe to the man who strives with God who formed him, a pot among earthen pots. Does the clay say to him who forms it, what are you making? Or your work has no handles? That's your verse, Joanne. Do we say to God, you made me without handles? Actually, I wish God did make me without handles, but the thing is we can't say to God, you made me wrong. You did something wrong here. And if I was making me, I would have done this. Okay, Paul even says the same thing in Romans chapter 9, verse 20. But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, why have you made me like this? See, the preacher is telling us in verse 11 that this is vanity. We have no control of our lives, no real control. It is useless to argue with God. And again, when we think that we have control and we make plans for our lives and we want to do this and it doesn't happen, then what do we usually do? We get mad at whom? We get mad at God. There's no advantage to trying to convince God. There's nothing to gain in arguing with God, he says. We cannot change his mind. We cannot influence him in any way. So the preacher then continues in verse 12 by saying, for who knows, he's asking the question here, who knows what is good for man while he lives the few days of his vain life, which just passes like a shadow. Okay, so our lives are here today and gone tomorrow. It goes so fast. And how do I know what's good for me? I don't really know what's good for me. I know what I like, but I don't really know what's best for me. We don't know what is good for us and what isn't good for us. We like to know, or at least but we don't. Only God knows what is best for us and best for his plans. You see, we've got to understand that we fit into his plans. Okay, we are part of God's story. God has written the book of life, not us. And our lives in this age, again, are just passing like a shadow. We only live a few days, and the older you get, the more you realize just how fast life zips by. Have you ever heard old people say that? I mean, I can remember when Jeremy was born and I was preparing for the first time, but that was yesterday. It's just gone. Where's the time gone? In Psalm 144, verse 4, it says, man is like a breath. His days are like a passing shadow. The shadow can move very quickly. It's here 1 minute and gone the next. And that's our life in this life. It passes like a shadow. We're born and then we die, and leaving no evidence that we ever impacted the world. In verse 12, the preacher is asked two questions. Who knows what is good for man? Of course, the answer is nobody knows what is good for us except the one who has planned our lives, God. And the second question is, who can tell man what will be after him? Who knows what tomorrow is going to bring? Okay, the future is uncertain. We can't know it. I mean, do you know what's going to happen tomorrow? Anybody here know what's going to happen tomorrow? No, we don't. Or the next day, do you know? Noah, do you know?
Yeah.
Oh.
You're... until it's my birthday.
Oh, okay. Well, you see, yeah, you know your birthday's coming, right?
Yep.
Yeah, but we don't actually know exactly what's happening tomorrow. I mean, is it going to be a sad day or is it going to be a happy day?
A happy day.
Good, yeah. Kids are so, yeah. We all want it to be that way, don't we? Okay? I mean, is somebody going to die or is somebody going to be born? Will I get the raise or will I get the pink slip? We don't really know. We just don't know that the future is hidden to us. And God has chosen not to let us know. We don't know what is good for us. We don't know what the future holds. But someone does. And of course that someone is God. Now, once we grasp the big message of Ecclesiastes that there is no meaning to this age and life escapes our control, then it begs the question, how should we live? So that's what he's doing. He's going to now give us some pointers about how do we live in this meaningless world. And there are a couple of options that we can take. I mean, the first option is we can escape life. And a lot of people do that. They go to work 9 to 5, they get home and it's boring and it's lonely. And the weekends are difficult, and so they drown themselves in their sorrows and in their situations, and they try to take the easy road to life, and they figure that it's best to dull your senses through partying and drinking and drugs and all those kinds of different vices. And as they age, they live in the past, in the good old days. I remember back when I was a kid, things were great back then. They live in this land of make-believe instead of the present. That's the first option, escapism. But the other option, and the option which the preacher promotes here, is to actually to live by faith. To live by faith. We don't know the future, but God does, and so we need to learn to trust Him for the future. We don't know what is best for us in the future, but God does. And so we need to learn to trust Him that He's going to bring the best to us. And the best doesn't always mean no pain or sorrow or heartache. If those come into your life, then those things were best for you and best for His plan. So we need to learn to live by faith in those situations. And Job even understood this. In Job 28:10, he asked the question, how are we to know where wisdom and understanding come from if it is hidden from man to know? That's a good question. And his answer comes in verse 23 where he says, God understands the way to it. He knows its place. He knows what's going to happen. And again, it's a statement of faith. And of course, then he says, well, I'm not going to get down on God. Yeah, this has been a hard time I'm sitting here in the ashes, tore my robes and I'm really hurting inside, but I'm going to trust God. And then one day he got up out of the ash heap and lived his life again. So we're to find meaning not from this life, because this life is meaningless, but we find meaning in the purpose for which God created man in the first place. Okay, when in Genesis 1, when God created the world and created man, He created it with a purpose and for a purpose. But sin interrupted that purpose. So we're not living this life, this world is not living any purpose. That's why it's meaningless. But we can still understand the purpose that God had for us and try to live in that purpose. Okay, where we think we have wisdom, we think we have life under control, that we have it all planned out. We've made our plans, we've set them in motion, but what happens when Monday morning comes and death or destruction comes knocking at the door? What happens when the doctor tells you that your own life is near its end, or the phone rings and it's heartbreaking news? I mean, it's at these moments when we realize that the control that we thought we had over our life was just self-deception. And there comes a time when we all discover that wisdom is out of reach and we don't understand what is happening. So what do we do then? Well, the preacher tells us, as I've already said, to trust God. For God knows and understands the purpose for everything that happens. So live by faith in His wisdom. So He wants us to learn what that wisdom is good. And it's good to have wisdom, but we also need to learn that He's put a limit on what we can know and the wisdom that we can gain. But we can still live with purpose. Now, to do that, what He has done is He wants us to understand how faith and wisdom and death relate to one another. Because our greatest teacher in all of life is death. We think of death as the enemy because of sin came death, and people die, and people age, and we grow old, and disease, and all of this is related to sin, and in that sense it is our enemy. But death has a way of making us come face to face with God and with the meaning of life. And so it can be a great teacher. So in chapter 7, verses 1 to 9, the preacher gives us a series of 7 proverbs. 7 proverbs that put faith into proper perspective. He uses this better than format to get the point across. Now, I forgot to advance that one. So we'll go to this one. So if you look at the screen here, then you can see how this is laid out for you, because it's not quite as clear when you look straight at your Bibles. So here's the 7 proverbs that he has. A good name is better than precious ointment. The day of your death is better than the day of your birth. Going to a funeral is better than going to a party. Sorrow is better than laughter. A rebuke is better than singing. The end is better than the beginning. Being patient and waiting is better than being proud. Now, out of context, this sounds kind of morbid and pessimistic, doesn't it? And you go, what? What is he saying here? It doesn't make any sense. But understand, the preacher is not a pessimist. Now, I know that when you read some commentaries, that they take that view and they say that the preacher is pessimistic, but he's not. He's not a pessimist. So what does he mean that the end of our life here in this age is better? Well, when I put it that way, now you can start actually thinking of why the end of our life would be better. Why is it? Well, it's because the end of our life begins the next life, the new life, which does have meaning, it does have purpose, and it is operating according to the purpose and plan of God. Wouldn't that be better, to live in a world that is meaningful and operating that way? This life, this age, is temporary and unfulfilling, while the next life is permanent and meaningful. Now, of course, again, you and I know that this is only true for the believer. and the preacher is actually coming to that conclusion. But you need to keep in mind here again that he is at a meeting where the author has gathered all of the people of God together, and the moderator has introduced the topic of how do we live in this meaningless world, and the preacher is speaking to the people of God, at least those that claim to be God's people. It sounds like a Sunday morning, doesn't it? And he is giving hope to the true believer, while at the same time he's bringing the gospel to the unbeliever. I mean, if there's any text that teaches us about the purpose and meaning of preaching Sunday mornings, well, this is it. See, I have to keep in mind that I'm preaching to you as God's people, so I want to help you to know God better and to be able to live in this meaningless world. But at the same time, I don't know for 100% certain of all of your hearts, and I know that some of our children have not come to the place of salvation yet. So I need to make sure that I have the gospel in the message. And the third thing we need to remember is that this is also poetry. So what he's saying is repetitive. He's saying the same thing in many different ways. Now, what we discover here is that when you look at the first lesson from chapter 1 through to the middle of 6, there was only one poem in there, and that's chapter 3, verses 2 It's that poem that about a season and a time for everything under heaven, right? There's a time to be born, a time. Okay, well, there he says there's a time to be born and a time to die. 3 verse 2. Here he says the day of death is better than the day of birth. There he said there's a time to mourn and a time to dance. Here he says it is better to mourn than to dance. There he said that there is a time to weep and a time to laugh. Here he says sorrow is better than laughter. So everything about this life, he has already told us, is preordained by God. Now, I don't know if I'm right about this or not. And certainly don't quote me. This is just something that came to my mind as I was thinking about this. But I get the sense here that the preacher is telling us that the next life may not be so ordained. You see that first point, that there's a time for everything. Everything's been planned out by God, and that we have no control in it. That's all because of the curse of sin. Does it make sense that because of the curse of sin, God can't trust us to plan our lives in this life? But when sin's curse is gone, that maybe in the next life there'll be more freedom? I don't know. But I sort of get this sense. And at any rate, what he's saying here is that the day of our death really instructs us about how we are to live in this world. Because we're not living for this world, we're living for the next world. Look at how the preacher makes this point, verse 1 of chapter 7. A good name is better than precious ointment. Now that's a good saying. That makes sense. It's kind of a lovely proverb. I mean, there's no sense smelling like a bunch of roses if every time someone mentions your name, the people cringe. You may look great and smell wonderful, but if your reputation and your character don't live up to your precious ointment, then who cares what you smell like? That's what he's talking about here. It might be good here to interject again that Sovereign Grace Family Church, we do not support wearing perfumes or aftershave or any other scented ointments. And we do that for the sake of those who have allergies to scents, right? We're showing God's grace one breath at a time. So there's just a little bit of a reminder there. But look at the last half of the verse. He says, everybody there is happy when a baby is born. They haven't done anything wrong yet. I mean, there's a lot of potential there. And we hope that the baby will grow up to be a great person. But you see, birth is all about potential, but death is all about fulfillment. And what are we doing in this? Well, we're trying to find fulfillment. We're trying to find purpose. Death is about fulfillment. Christian parents have hopes and dreams for their kids, but it's only at the moment of death that anyone perfectly receives what Christ has won for them. Death is the fulfillment of life, and fulfillment is better than potential. But the preacher is actually saying more than that here. He is asking us to consider, what will people say about you at your funeral? See, this is how it teaches us about how to live. What will people say about you at his funeral, at your funeral? So today just happens to be our first son's birthday. And when Jeremy was born and we held him in our arms and people were coming and visiting and seeing him, they would go, "Oh, isn't he beautiful? He looks just like his mother." And somebody else would come along and say, "He looks just like his father." I mean, there was nothing more that they could say. "Oh, I can see his grandfather's eyes. He's got his grandma nanny's ears." You see, there's nothing more that we can say about the baby. But when the question is, what were they going to say at Jeremy's funeral? What will people say about me at my funeral? What will people say about you at your funeral? I mean, will they say you live by faith? Will they say that you are like Jesus, that you are kind and generous and loving, that your name that you built for yourself was like a precious ointment? Or will they say you loved your gardening and your knitting or bingo? You see, the day of your death is better than the day of your birth, because a coffin is a better preacher than a crib. When life ends, everything about life comes into focus. How are we to live in this upside down world? Well, we live to make a good name so that when we die, it preaches to the people who are left. I've been to lots of funerals where the preacher hasn't a clue. And people get up there and they say all these wonderful accolades, and then when you're listening to them talk afterwards at the reception, you hear them say, "Oh, he was a real mean, ornery." You see, what are they doing? We don't want to be remembered for that. The meaning of life doesn't come until life is over. But it's not just being a good person that counts. It's being a person who considers the work of God. That's what he's going to tell us in verse 13. And one who fears God. That's what he tells us in verse 18. But I don't want to overstep my mark. So look at verse 4. In verse 4, the preacher tells us that there are two types of people at a funeral. Two types of people at a funeral. There's the wise person, and there is the foolish person. The wise person, he says, actually learns from death. And the foolish person, he dismisses death. So the fool is escaping life, whereas the wise person is looking life face on. There's a time to be born, there's a time to die. The fool can't wait to get out of there, while the wise person asks himself, what will people say about me at my funeral? Am I prepared to die? The fool tries to escape life. The wise doesn't fear death, but welcomes its coming. You know, it wasn't until Ebenezer Scrooge listened to death that he learned to live. If you live in denial of death, what is there to do but to eat, laugh, and drink, and party on? Verse 6 tells us that the laughter of fools is like the crackling of thorns under a pot. And what he is talking about here is you've put a pot on a fire, obviously to probably boil water in the pot, but you haven't put wood under the pot in the fire. You've put thorns, and thorns make all of these crackling noises, and it kind of sounds really neat, but it's short-lived because they burn out really quickly, and the water never does come to a boil. And he's saying that escaping life and death doesn't make your life amount to anything. It results in no purpose at all. And your life at death certainly will not inspire anyone. When you have dealt with death, you actually have vigor to live. And even though life is hard and there are struggles and there are pains and there's heartaches and life sometimes seems out of control, death teaches us that we can trust God who knows the future and who wisely plans our life today. You see, you don't have to have all of the answers. You just need to know that what is happening to you, God knows. You don't need to know why it's happening to you. God knows the why. This life, you see, is on loan. It's a gift from God. That was one of his other lessons. And one day he's going to say, well, time is up. And when he does say that, are you ready to go? Better is the end than the beginning. It is better because it ends this life and starts the next. Now we know in part, then we will know fully. Now is the curse, then is the rest. See, I'm waiting for that day. And sometime it will be coming. And if you want a meaning to life, make it that your death teaches what it means to live by faith. So in verse 8, when the preacher says that the patient spirit is better than the proud spirit, he's talking about living by faith. The believer can be patient when the struggles come. He's not filled with anxiety. When it comes, he can be sad, and especially at first, but he knows endurance. He has the strength and the peace to be able to endure through the hardships. And even when death is coming, those kinds of things don't come to him with a shock. I mean, we persevere because we know the future. So I remember when the doctor first told me I had cancer, my first response was shock. Oh man, I could be dying soon. But then I realized, what am I worried about? That's going to be the best thing that ever happens to me. That would be sad for everybody that's left, but this is what happens. God knows the future. He knows what is best. The proud want to be in charge, but it doesn't work that way. They become angry at God, angry at life, angry at everybody, and there's no hope. We were in the hospital this week. I had a CT scan done, and there was an old man that came in there. He was just, it was sad. It was sad not because he was so belligerent to the nurses and life was to him was obviously a hardship and he had full of anxiety, but sad because it just showed that he had no hope at all. Well, we come to verses 10 and 14, and in verses 10 to 14 we have the final instructions. So I want you to notice there that in verse 10, 11, and 12, there's a word that's repeated 3 times, and it's the word wisdom. Okay, it's mentioned 3 times. And then in verses 13 and 14, you see the word God that is mentioned there twice. And what the preacher is telling us here in the conclusion is that true wisdom on how we are to live in this world comes from having a relationship with God. See, he's not the pessimist. He's the evangelist. In verse 10, the preacher assumes that we're kind of at the end of our lives, that we are old, that we're in the nursing home, that death is just around the corner. And a lot of people in those kinds of situations, they look to the past and they ask the question, why is the past better than the present? You know, in other words, I'm overwhelmed with this life. I wish I was younger. I wish I was back there. And why is this happening? And he's saying that their first assumption there is actually wrong, because the past never was better. I mean, there were some days in the past that were pretty good, and sometimes it might be nice to go back to them. But even the good days, you know, I really loved the days, my summer days when I was growing up. We'd go to Midland. But you know what? I've been there as an adult, and the place has totally changed. And so all of these memories, they don't exist anymore because the place doesn't exist the way it did. Even the good days of the past would become bad days if we have to live them over and over again like Groundhog Day. Okay? But when you ask why it was better then than now, what we're doing is we're denying the reality of God in the present. If you think that things are worse today than they were yesterday, and it's very possible that they might be, what you're saying is that we think that God is no longer in control. Is that what we're saying? That God is no longer in control? Does it mean that God no longer loves us, or that He has a useful plan for us just because things have gotten worse? No. To ask that question in verse 10, he says, is unwise because it forgets about God. David Gibson in his book said, when we ask this, it is because we are blind to the good things of the present and ignorant of the evil of the past. In verse 11, the preacher is saying that the good news comes from God is actually attached to an inheritance. Now that's a New Testament concept, isn't it? That the good things that come to us from God are attached with an inheritance. But it's only an inheritance. Look at it. It says, it is only for those who see the sun. Do you notice that he changed up that phrase? It's not for those under the sun. It is for those who can see beyond the sun. It is for those who have received an inheritance from God. The inheritance is not this world. Our inheritance is the world to come. Hebrews 9:15 tells us that Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance. Wow. And Peter tells us that our inheritance can never perish, never spoil, never fade, and that it is an inheritance that is kept in heaven for you. 1 Peter 1:3-5. So in verse 12, the preacher, without knowing it, he's really talking about Jesus Christ. He's talking about having this relationship with God that comes because of his plan of redemption that has been there from the beginning. It's a relationship of faith with God where he preserves the life of him who has it. Okay, he tells us then in verse 14, he says, consider the works of God. And man cannot make sense of this crooked world. Lots of things happen, it just doesn't make sense, right? And we can't make it straight. But who can make this crooked world have sense? Who can make a crooked life, sinful life like ours, a depraved life, who can make it straight? God can, right? God can. God is making all things new. Death is the result of sin, and it is the experience of all people. But it is not the end. Jesus conquered death. Jesus said in John 11, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet he shall live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. He's not talking about the death from this world, but he's talking about even if death should take us in this world, we will be raised to new life in the world to come. So how are you to live in this world? Well, verse 14 gives us the final answer. And it is to be joyful in the days of prosperity, so in other words, in the good days, but also in the days of adversity. But we don't know which day will come tomorrow, and we can't plan it out either. All we can do is accept the prosperity and the adversity as it comes from the hand of God. So I know that some of us are going through some difficult times, but it comes from God. It's in his plan for us. It is what is best for us. And when we can live by faith in the fact that by saying that, God, yes, I accept this from you, then we will learn how to persevere through it all with faith and hope. So our purpose then must be to fulfill the reason that God has created us. And that, of course, is to glorify God in everything that life brings to us. 1 Corinthians 10:31. So this fact, of course, guarantees that our lives are significant. And why does it guarantee that our lives are significant? That God created us to glorify him? Because it tells us that it means that we are important to God. We're important to God not because he needed us. Never go to that conclusion. God did not create man because he needed us. He never needed us. But he created us to bring him glory, and that makes us important to him. Psalm 16:11, you make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. And of course, and this leads to the question of what is ultimate in your life. Where do you find your security, your peace of mind? And the answer to this question tells you how well you will deal with life's losses, life's struggles, and life's trials. What is your true source of happiness, meaning, and hope? We are important to God. Our significance is defined by the fact that God wants a relationship with us when he doesn't need it. When we start to act in ways that fulfill that purpose, then we begin to experience an intensity of joy that we have never known before. When we begin to appreciate God as the Creator who deserves all praise, then our hearts will not rest until we give him glory with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and in everything that life gives us. Amen.